This is the What If APUSH project by Cooper Barr and Ryan Murphy. Point of a divergence is what if Abraham Lincoln had a headache and decided to stay home from Ford's Theater in 1865. On April 15th, 1865, just 3 days after the conclusion of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died hours later, leaving his Vice President Andrew Johnson to deal with rebuilding the United States after the Civil War. Johnson had to deal with the newly freed slaves, rebuilding the South, and rebuilding the Union. The North and South were very separate, so this would be a hard task. Previous presidents focused on temporary fixes to the sectional divide, but Andrew Johnson would need to find a permanent solution to unite the Union and ensure the freedom of blacks. Unfortunately, it would take until the 1960s for blacks to be treated as first-class citizens. This was largely Andrew Johnson's fault. Lawrence Gibson would write in the magazine, the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, about 45 years later, reflecting on Johnson's presidential qualifications.
He states, Lincoln's own superior qualifications to deal with Reconstruction, as well as the utter lack of fitness of his successor, have been major premises which through long acceptance have really become axiomatic.
While some people, like Lawrence Gibson, believe that Andrew Johnson's lack of presidential fitness led to the failure of Reconstruction, others believed it was his political alignment. After all, he was a Southern Democrat. Elizabeth Barron, a professor at the University of Virginia, says that
Johnson's strong commitment to obstructing political and civil rights for blacks is principally responsible for the failure of Reconstruction to solve the race problem in the South and perhaps in America as well.
ultimately Andrew Johnson's policies, such as vetoing the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and attitude towards blacks, led to the failure of Reconstruction. Black codes developed in the South, restricting the freedom of blacks. Former Confederates were still able to maintain political power, and Johnson pardoned almost all of them. Andrew Johnson was a reason blacks did not enjoy the same privilege as whites until the 1960s. However, this all could have been changed if Abraham Lincoln had got a headache and decided to stay home from Ford's Theater. Had Abraham Lincoln survived to continue serving as president, he would have enjoyed a Republican dominated Congress. This would have allowed him in Congress to easily pass legislation that would help incorporate blacks into society. Lincoln supported the 10% Reconstruction Plan to rebuild the Union, stating that 10% of voters in the 1860 election would take a pledge of allegiance to the United States, then draft a new constitution and create a new government for the state to then be readmitted. Chester Arthur, a United States Senator from New York at the time, said this regarding Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan.
The Civil War is achieving its purpose. Lincoln's swift undertaking of the ordeal of Reconstruction has already seen the integration of blacks into society. It was no certainty, with strong Southern opposition, that blacks would be treated as whites and that the Union would be preserved.
Abraham Lincoln seizes the opportunity to carry out the purpose of the Civil War and establishes strong support in the North. However, there is still a lot of opposition and an assassination attempt takes place. A witness recounts,
I saw the man enter the restaurant. I thought nothing of it until he pulled the revolver out of his coat. He took aim, but the shot went wide right, missing the president. The assassin fled the restaurant and into the night. I was not able to get a good look at him.
The assassination attempt shows the strong divides still in American society. Around the same time as the assassination attempt, black codes begin to develop in the South, and Southerners begin using fear to keep blacks from voting. Lincoln realizes greater force may be needed to keep blacks integrated in society. Congress passes a bill ordering federal troops to occupy southern states and arresting anyone suspected of threatening black suffrage. Specifically, the bill states,
Federal troops are to be used in all former Confederate states to secure elections and ensure blacks are not deprived of their rights and liberties. Furthermore, anyone suspected of infringing on someone's voting rights will lead to their imprisonment without bail.
Lincoln's bill leads to many unlawful arrests and the imprisonment of innocent people. He infringes on the American principles of probable cause, unlawful arrests, and unreasonable searches. As threats from the South increase, more laws are passed, restricting freedom of speech, press, and due process. This is similar to his suspension of habeas corpus in the Civil War. However, he is keeping blacks integrated in society. Lincoln is viewed very negatively by modern day people. One magazine article from 2016 recounts.
There is no doubt that Lincoln succeeded in integrating freedmen into society. However, he did at the cost of being a dictator. His integration of blacks caused him to replace the United States Constitution with his own interests. His suspension of trial by jury and restrictions on freedom of speech should have been a surprise to no one after he suspended habeas corpus early in the Civil War. His complete disregard of America's founding principles makes him one of the worst presidents in United States history.
It wasn't just one interview. Most people in modern day America believe he was a terrible president, even though he did manage to integrate blacks into society. However, the costs were too high. A podcaster brings a member of the United States House of Representatives onto his podcast in 2020.
Now, John, we have been discussing Lincoln's presidency for the show. A look back, what can you tell us about the abuse of federal power in the 1860s?
Well, Bill, Lincoln acted like he was a king. He took liberties that no president had took before. He took his role as commander-in-chief to the fullest extent that he could by gathering troops and blockading southern ports. Both of these were powers that Congress should hold.
Even though Lincoln was viewed negatively, his policy helped curb racism in the United States. The U.S. leads the world in racial equality. An Indian politician speaks in 2010 regarding the U.S.'s achievements.
The idea of racism is still deeply rooted in Indian society. I think the United States should serve as a role model for how we should eradicate it. Starting with Abraham Lincoln, the United States began to eradicate racism. The idea of racism is strange to the American people, and I think as Indians we should aim to achieve what they have.
Had Abraham Lincoln not gone to Ford's Theater in April of 1865, the United States would look very different today. There would not have been a civil rights movement in the 1960s, and racism would have been very limited in the United States likely by the 1930s. Black codes, Jim Crow laws, and segregation would not have developed had Lincoln lived. The U.S. would be looked up to by other countries regarding racism. However, Lincoln would have still been viewed very negatively. He would have had to suspend some inherently American liberties, rights, and principles, making modern day people regard him as a dictator. Mount Rushmore would likely only have three faces, or Lincoln's face would be replaced with Andrew Jackson's or maybe FDR's. If Lincoln served another term or two, America would have looked differently politically, economically, culturally, and the domestic and foreign policy of the United States would be very different. That is the presentation. Thanks for listening.